Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining this week's panel conversation. I'm really excited that you're giving up a little bit of your time to listen in on this. We use these sessions as an opportunity to share perspectives and ideas and things that are working for communities around the topic of engagement, and now specifically around the use of the federal ARPA monies as people and communities are gearing up for coming out of the pandemic in local government. We've got three excellent panelists today that we're going to be interviewing, and really looking forward to getting their perspectives on what's working for them. We hope that you'll be able to pick up a new perspective and a new idea, something that you'll be able to use in the work that you're doing, or simply in understanding of the work of local government. So thanks for being part of the conversation. Here's the agenda real quickly on how the day will go forward. I'll introduce the panelists real quickly and give them an opportunity to add anything that they like, and then we'll jump into the questions and then wrap up. I'll do my best to keep this under an hour, and so that we can benefit from the perspectives, but keep it within a reasonable time frame. So with that, let's just kind of jump into the introductions. Really happy today to introduce Jeff Mihelich, I'm sorry, Jeff. Jeff is Bozeman city manager and started back in 2020. He's a credentialed city manager with ICMA and has had experience in a lot of large cities, small cities, counties. He was most recently in Fort Collins as their deputy city manager and chief operating officer, but also worked in Surprise, Arizona as its assistant manager and community and economic development director. But he also spent some time in Illinois early in his career. Jeff has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Portland State University, and really excited about having Jeff participate. Jeff, you had some great, I read the article in Route 50 this last week about some of the great engagement work that you're doing. And so I'm really excited about hearing what else you're doing in Bozeman, but would welcome you to just kind of add a little bit more to your background if you'd like. Oh, Jeff, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. Just excited to share some ideas. Yeah, I think you covered my background really well, but you're right. I've been really interested in providing unique ways for communities to engage in city policy issues, and the last several places I've worked in. So looking forward to the conversation. I know we're going to drill down and talk about ARPA because it's complicated, and I think a lot of folks have different ideas in our various communities. It'll be fun to share out what we're trying to do here in Bozeman. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great panel. I want to introduce Doug Matthews, who is the assistant city manager in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've known Doug but a little bit, but have really respected the work that Doug has done with his career, and particularly around engagement and some of the innovative things that local governments are doing. He's been in Grand Rapids for a while, but he also spent a considerable amount of time as a communications director in Austin, Texas, as well as a few other Florida communities. Doug's a graduate of Central Florida with a master's in public administration, and has also been working on the board of directors for the Alliance for Innovation, which is an organization that I historically have respected really a lot. Doug, thank you for being part of the conversation, and would love it if you would add a little bit more to your background.
Well, sure. I just, on the engagement side, I've been pretty deeply involved with not just the technology around community engagement in the public sector, but civic technology in general, and doing what it is that I can to provide guidance and advice. Sometimes it's been invited, sometimes it's been welcome, sometimes it's probably been uninvited and inconvenient. But I find that partnership is really what helps advance the work that all of us do. So, I'm certainly happy to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Just from a company standpoint, and your relationship with Polco, it's been great to connect you with my colleagues, and I know there's just a huge level of respect for the work that you're doing and what you contribute to not only just in the conversations, but also to local government in general. So thanks for being here.
Appreciate it.
Let me introduce our third panelist. Logan Martin is a good friend of mine. He served as a city administrator for the city of Rosemont, Minnesota, since 2017. Rosemont is one of the fastest growing cities in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. It's currently around 26,000 population right now. But they're adding just tons of housing units every year. Logan has prior experience in a couple other communities in Minnesota and has just been one of those kind of rising stars in local government. Logan, I really appreciated the work that it's been kind of fun to watch your career develop over time, and really appreciate calling you a friend, and really thank you for being part of the conversation today. You want to share a little bit more about your background?
Well, those are kind words, Matt. I appreciate that. And I've appreciated your mentorship and friendship as well. And you're a leader in Minnesota city management, and of course, now nationwide city management with your roles in Polko and then ICMA before that. So a lot of respect for Matt, and honored to be with you here today. But that's my background. I didn't include my education. I went to Gustavus Adolphus College for my undergrad and then Hammond University for my master's degree. But have a real passion as kind of a millennial city manager, I'll say, for civic engagement, use of technology, digitization efforts, things of that nature. So excited to learn from my colleagues here and share whatever nuggets that I can.
That's super. Thanks a lot, Logan. Well, let's kick into the discussion. The topic of the day is value of community engagement under the American Rescue Plan Act. You know, given the last couple of years that we've all gone through, it comes as no surprise that there's just been such an unsettled environment. And now as we have this opportunity to start working our way back to some sense of normalcy, the importance of engaging with our community and our residents and all of our stakeholders becomes all that much more important, because the priorities of what was in 2018 may very well not be the priorities today. And the world has changed a lot. Engagement has never been easy. And so the idea about finding ways to effectively engage becomes all that much more important when you lay over all of the dynamics of what we have gone through. Not only do you have the pandemic, but you've got all of the civil unrest, you've got all of the political divisiveness that's going on in the community, the whole change in the way people work and the remote work environments, not only community-wide, but even organizationally in local government. And so the notion of how you engage with your community and your residents as you're now emerging from the pandemic and having the access and the availability of all this federal money becomes really an important conversation to have. And these conversations are really about just sharing ideas and perspectives and ways that communities can benefit from what other folks are doing. So there's three questions that I want to get into hearing your responses on. The first one is, how are you identifying the community needs and priorities that you're going to be addressing under the ARPA Act? Second is, how does resident input impact the way that you deliver public services in the community? Not how you're collecting resident input, but what role does resident input play in decision-making process? And then finally, love to get a sense for, what are you finding successful strategies, tools, for engaging with your public and for tracking the performance that you have and you're doing as a community? So let's kick on to that. And Jeff, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. Can you talk about what Bozeman is doing in going through your community needs assessment as you get geared up for starting to use the federal resources?
Happy to do that. I think I do want to back up and talk about one thing, and then I'll answer the question more directly. I think the thing that's challenging with the ARPA funding is that there are significant strings and limitations to it. Unlike the CARES money, which came in before, CARES money, once you received it, there was a lot of different ways that you could use that money in your community. The ARPA funds are a little different. There's quite a significant federal standards. And then depending on which state you're in the United States, sometimes that money went to the state, and there's additional competitive grants that you can go through to apply as well. So what's been really important for us is really to set the stage in any of our engagement dialogues to say what we can spend our money on and what we can't spend the money on, which is much more important. It couldn't be just, hey, we have in Bozeman, a $12 million direct allocation. What would you like to do with it? I think that creates false expectations. But what we did was we went to actually a lot of different community service organizations in our community and said, look, what are your highest priority needs to move the city forward within your different entity? And what are those? And then we'll come back to you and say, here are some eligible activities that we can fund with ARPA. So again, it's, what are the limitations on the funding? Engage your different providers within the community and then see if there's a good fit. And then lastly, what we did was we looked at the city commission's strategic priorities, and then all of our strategic documents, whether it's our climate action plan, our comprehensive land use plan, or our capital improvements plan, identify those highest priorities, and then again, see if there's a match between those highest priorities and what's in the ARPA funding. Thank you.
Were there any surprises, Jeff, as you were working with your community partners in terms of what you identified as priorities that maybe you didn't anticipate in your strategic plans?
It was less about surprises and just more kind of the bad news that we couldn't help fund certain things. The biggest priority in the city of Bozeman by far is community affordable housing. And because we received a direct allocation and we're not an entitlement community, we didn't get a community development block grant allocation, we actually can't use ARPA funds to provide direct subsidy to affordable housing, even though not everybody, many people in the community would say, why can't you invest in affordable housing? So we actually got creative with it, where we are actually using our ARPA funds to extend sewer and water into areas that are really undevelopable without the extension of infrastructure. And that effectively unlocks those properties for development. And then later on, we're negotiating with the property owners, developers to get affordable housing in that development. So it's using ARPA funds to do what the community wants, which is affordable housing. It's just the first critical piece, and that's infrastructure. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, kind of helping get that base infrastructure in place so it makes that affordable housing more affordable. Yeah, great. Thank you. Doug, can you share with us how Grand Rapids is going about developing its community needs assessment as you prepare to use the federal ARPA funds?
Well, sure, and I do appreciate the reference back to the original CARES Act funding, because I think we all went through a process at that time with the community and likely with our respective elected bodies to prioritize where those investments should be. And there are certainly some things that carry over when you talk about the kind of the categories that are outlined in ARPA. So really where we started was we had taken the commission through a process of identifying, okay, well, what are the key priorities as we're considering where we want to invest? And they identified 5 or 6 key priority areas. And we brought those back forward in this process as kind of a check to say, okay, well, are these still the key priorities, or have they changed? And then put the overlay of, are they still eligible under the new funding requirements? So that kind of provided us initial roadmap of what it is that we wanted to do. We were also going through our budget process at the same time. So we've got a July 1st budget. So, check hit the bank about 3 weeks before the budget year started. The first thing that we did is look at the formulas for revenue replacement and make sure that we were fully leveraging that. Grand Rapids is a sales tax city, or not. I'm sorry, not sales tax. We're an income tax city. So we were hit pretty hard, not just because of the downturn in the economy, but because you had so many people that were telecommuting, which affects our ability to recover income tax. If somebody was forced to stay at home, then we can't recover those income taxes. If they do it electively, we can. So our first priority was making sure that we stabilize the budget. And then we looked at the formulas to determine, okay, beyond kind of what our projections were, can we maximize those formulas as a means of increasing the flexibility of the available money? So, if that money falls to general fund, well, then we have all the flexibility that a city has in determining where we can make those investments. The remainder is what we've set aside, aligned it with those original commission priorities, but then started to carve out some creative things that we could do. And we were just talking about this before we got on. One of those was we made the decision we were going to carve out $2 million and we were going to do a participatory budgeting process with the community, understanding that many times within our wards, there may be priorities that they have that aren't necessarily aligned either in priority or in timing with the things that are in our budget. So this gives us an opportunity to really lean into participatory democracy, create some ownership, and hopefully solve some problems within each of our respective wards that both are in alignment with ARPA, but also bring them into the process.
Look, did you find during that process, first of all, congratulations, and I'm excited to kind of see how the participatory budgeting rolls out. But during the identification of key priorities and then engaging in the community, were there any surprise priorities that emerged in that conversation?
No, I mean, if you imagine the period of time that the conversations were being had, affordable housing was already brought up. I think everybody's having conversations about that. One of the investments we committed to early was setting aside basically a seed investment for a longer term affordable housing fund at the city. But then you had violence reduction, you had public safety reform. There were all things that probably anyone that's working in city management has been having similar conversations. What I'm interested to see is how those priorities align then with the things that we get that are naturally generated from people who live in our neighborhoods and in our wards, to see how those things match up and see if there are some areas where we may have had some blind spots.
Yeah, I think having that at a ward level conversation is going to be pretty interesting to see where those differences lie. So yeah, thank you. Logan, can you talk about what Rosemont is doing in its community needs assessment process as you start thinking about how to spend the federal ARPA funds?
Yeah, happy to. We were really fortunate to have just come off of the completion of our 5-year strategic planning process. And so we had just re-upped our previous 5-year strategic planning process. And so had a really good, I would say, pulse check on the city's goals, priorities, and strategic directions, and council alignment really surrounding that document. And so we're able to really push into that document as we're starting to think about how to use ARPA funds. I would echo what these two gentlemen said too, that the freedom that was maybe inside of CARES Act is missing inside of ARPA. And so we're a fast growing community. And so a lot of our stressors there then are infrastructure extensions. And so we would have loved to have been able to spend the funding on some roadway extension projects. And so to the affordable housing conversation, flipping some gravel roadways to pavement roadways to incentivize housing and high density or medium density housing out in some of those areas of town, aren't able to do that inside of ARPA. So instead, what we're talking about doing is extending utilities, much like I think Jeff had mentioned. But for us, more on the job creation side, we're very strong on housing. Our housing is not entirely affordable, but we are getting some density in some of our downtown areas, which is helpful and helping in that regard. But we're 36 square miles and only about 1/3 developed at 26,000 or so in population. And so we're getting a lot of distribution centers, as I'm sure you guys might be as well, if you've got open land. And we're near a highway infrastructure that's really supportive of distribution centers. And so we're facing this conversation of how many Amazon distribution centers does one community or one region, Amazon, FedEx, Home Depot, whatever the case may be, how many of them can you handle? Because we've got some parcels of land that are 400, 600, 800 acres that are ready for an industrial office, kind of mega complex like that. So where will those people live? How will they get here? We're kind of struggling with all of those conversations right now. So we intend to use some of our funds, or the majority of our funds, for utility extensions to get out to those areas to allow that job creation to happen. And maybe the last thing I'll say is the council's really main direction was the impact of the ARPA funds needs to be felt community-wide. We weren't going to invest in broadband for 100-unit subdivision that needs it. We were going to have an impact that is felt community-wide. And so if we can do utility extensions that would have been funded by core funds otherwise via taxes and other enterprise funds, the notion is that we have suppressed the need to increase utilities or increase taxes because we used federal funds to do that utility project.
Yeah, that's cool. And I love to hear that, because you do have such a great development opportunity there of being using the funds to kind of be transformational and community-wide impact, all of those kinds of things. Did your 5-year strategic plan, were there any variations that came up as the ARPA funds became available and you engaged with your community?
Not really. The community is very excited about the growth trajectory for the most part, I would say. And so we have a lot of folks that are really, the community seems aligned that housing begets commercial. We're ready for commercial. We're excited about the commercial that's forthcoming. And so I think that there's the general push that the council hears out in the community is, I'm tired of spending my money in our surrounding communities. I want to spend our money locally. And so this development pattern is supported by the community, I would say, because it will allow them to shop locally a bit more or a lot more.
Yeah, cool. Lots of good stuff coming up in Rosemont. Thank you. Doug, can you talk about how community input influences how you meet resident, business, and stakeholder needs?
Sure. Since I've been here, so I've been here a little short of 3 years at this point, and one of the commission's priorities was really expanding and formalizing the way that we go about community engagement. It's important for us that there's a, kind of a consistent and thoughtful methodology in the way that we go about it, so that the residents or the participants and the departments that may be doing engagement have kind of a common understanding of what the expectations and the outcome should be. When we talk about how it is that we use that, one of the things that we consistently reinforce as we're going through the engagement process is that you can't really call your engagement successful if you're not sharing the results of that engagement and then linking the results of those engagement with the actions that you have or haven't taken. And I'm very precise when I say have or haven't. If you haven't, you ought to have a narrative explanation for what it is that you've done and why. So, part of engagement is getting better intelligence about the activities that you're doing. And part of the engagement is effectively a communications tool. And, you can talk about the theories around gaining consent as opposed to gaining ownership, and it really depends by the project. But we try to apply a blend of engagement to assist with the decision-making process. So we've got some tools where we're doing real-time engagement, and that's one of the things that Polko does, where you can do those quick polls to get real-time information. And then you've got the longer-term engagement, like the community survey. Grand Rapids, when I got here, had not, to anyone's knowledge, had not done a comprehensive, scientifically valid community survey, at least in the past few decades. We had just adopted a strategic plan, and they were working through the measures that were associated with the plan. And my question was, okay, well, how do we know if we're meeting our objectives if we're not asking the question? And then how do we know if we're meeting those objectives if we're not looking at comparable communities and our performance over time? So in the big picture aspect, gaining community engagement is directly linked to what it is that we have in our strategic plan. And the strategic plan is what drives our budgeting process every year. So at the macro level, that's how we use the engagement. That feedback has a direct link through the plan to our budget.
That's an excellent way of saying it. You know what? I've never heard it said this way, Doug, but I love it that you said it this way. And that is the difference between consent and ownership. That's when you know that you're engaging really effectively, when you can get to that point where people have ownership, and you're closing the loop, so people appreciate the reasons why you may not go forward on a project just as importantly as going forward. And then the linkages between the engagement to the strategic thinking to the alignment of resources becomes just that logical path. So thanks for laying it out that way. It's that was very helpful. Appreciate that. Logan, can you talk about how community input influence how you deal with meeting business and resident needs in Rosemont?
Yeah, that's a tough act to follow there on Doug. That was hitting the home run there. But it's really important to us. We have a really engaged community. As of now, social media has been a big thing for us. They've been really diving in on our social media pages of recent, and we've got some new energy and a new staff member working in that field that's really crushing her work. And so our ability to engage with folks kind of in a real-time basis on social media has kind of been really revolutionized, I would say, in the last couple of years. And so really excited about that. We've had the pages for a long time, but are finally putting a good amount of push behind those. Polko, we've been a proud Polko customer since the very beginning, I think, here in Minnesota, and admittedly have been not using it to its full capacity. And so we're excited to start doing that again now in kind of in context with our NCS survey, which is just about to hit the mailboxes in the next couple of weeks. And so NCS is going to be utilizing Polko logins and signups and stuff like that. And so that's going to really help us build our base. And so going forward, then we're planning kind of a monthly new topic with our Polko subscription. So that's department by department. So 1 month is police, 1 month is community development, 1 month is finance, etc. Really excited to roll that out and start using that quite a bit more. And then the other thing I would say that we're trying to do and finding a lot of success in is council is really committed to finding residents where they are. And so they're not forcing folks to come into City Hall. So we do a thing called Council Out and About, where we bought a grill that you can tow behind a truck, and we will go to a park, go to a soccer game, we'll grill hot dogs, get people to come talk to the council, engage with the council, share feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. So we did another fun event where we brought a snowplow to a football game and allowed people to put painted handprints on the snowplow. And then now they got to, watch the snowplow come flying down the street as their handprints, of course, melted away as the snow hit it for enough times in a row. But it was a fun idea and just a cool, not only see the equipment, but engage with the community. So the council out and about idea has been really cool. We tried it initially where we bought, donuts and coffee and invited them in, and it didn't work. And so we pivoted and said, we're going to go kind of force ourselves an invite to your soccer game or your, party at our Halloween party at our community center. We're coming to it. We're going to be there. And you're going to meet the council. And then I guess one of the last things too, that's a cool story for us about engagement is we have 5 development pockets throughout the community that are kind of our next phase as the town moves from west to east. And we did a long-term engagement process on visualizing what those quadrants will look like. Put a branding campaign around it called Connect with Your Future in Rosemount. And so getting ideas or getting folks to think about community connections, not only parks, trails, transit, but also connecting with kind of the organization, your neighbors, community groups, etc. So the Connect with Your Future campaign has been really successful and a fun one to watch. And then it's also an effective economic development tool that we're showing that to developers to say, here's what we envision at these corners. Let's go make it happen. So,
hey, Logan, when your council talks about their strategic planning process, do they talk a lot about formalizing the engagement effort or the engagement intentions? So to make sure that resident input is part of that planning effort. I mean, I love to hear about the neighborhood-based stuff, and I want to talk to you more about that when we get into the next question. But I'm just kind of curious about the level of priority that the community has, or what examples can you demonstrate of how important resident input is in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, there's a big focus on trying to find metrics to gauge, what level of reach we're getting. We have a technology task force, and I was at the meeting last night, and they've been talking about the ranking score. I forget the acronym, but that businesses use to know how they are being viewed in the marketplace. That we should start considering that potentially as a community as well. How is the city viewed in the community? How easy was your building permit? How helpful was the utility billing clerk? What have you? So to start to gauge those metrics on engagement, customer service, recognition of what we do, those kind of things.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I can't think of the term either, but I know exactly what you're talking about, and good for you. I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. Jeff, can you talk about how community input influences the work and public services that you're delivering in Bozeman?
Yeah, it's critical to the city, to the point where over the past year, we developed a formal engagement strategy for the entire city and how we use different techniques to engage our community on big initiatives. And one of the biggest pillars of it is simply this: when we're talking about a new major initiative in the city, and it could be use of ARPA funds, which we covered earlier today, a new comprehensive land use plan, a new climate action plan, whoever's in charge of that, whichever department has the X on their back, if you will, has to, on the front end, develop a formal engagement plan solely for that initiative. And they actually have to submit that to me, and I take a look at it. That's how much of a priority it is in our community. And I alluded to this before, but what we try to do on the very front end is to make sure that when residents and stakeholders and business owners start to engage in the process, they know where they are in that process. Because sometimes our engagement is simply to inform. That's more just traditional communication, but it is just an informing. It's one way. The second level would really be, maybe it's a discussion of alternatives. What do you think about these options for this initiative? The third is when we actually collaborate. We use that in land use planning, where residents, neighborhoods come together and say, hey, if we have this ideal development, what would you like to see here? That's collaboration. And then the fourth piece, which is actually pretty rare, but we do it on occasion, is the residents actually make the decision, right? And I think it's critically important that when people start engaging, they know whether we're informing, collaborating, discussing alternatives, or making a decision. Because when people assume they're making the decision and they're not, they can get frustrated really fast. And I think different uses of technology can help us do this. I heard both previous folks talk about going to where people are. And I've had that philosophy for a couple decades now, but COVID's made that really tricky, over the past few years. But what you can do is use different forms of technology to make sure you know who's in the room, what exactly people are saying with measurable statistics, and then understand what people are feeling about the engagement process. So really quickly, is when people come to an engagement meeting, one of the first things we do is we do a quick live survey that people can respond to. Who are you? We do some demographics. How old are you? Where do you live? Are you affiliated with a group? And then what do you expect to get out of this meeting? Real time, and everybody sees the results. Then we have the engagement process. And at the end, we say, did you get what you wanted out of this process? Do you agree with it so far? Are you still dissatisfied, and why? Right? So it's polling. Because one thing that's always driven me nuts in my career when we have engagement is when people walk up to a podium and say, I'm saying this, and everybody here in this room agrees with me. And that's usually not the case. But if you actually have people go through a polling exercise where they use clicker technology or tick, you actually see the results. And no one can say everybody agrees with me, because you see the results on the screen. Thanks.
That is just excellent insight and input. So thanks for sharing that, because communication and engagement does take different forms and flavors depending upon what you're trying to accomplish. Totally understand that. And I love to hear about the formal engagement planning process for your individual projects. Has that worked pretty effectively? And there's probably a lot of communities that have not done that specific kind of an approach. Any kind of tips or advice that you would add to that part of the conversation?
Yeah, I would say this. One, it truly has to be on the front end. It's like, we're going to do this initiative. And what people always ask, and it doesn't matter if you're a staff member, an elected official in particular, or a resident, how is this going to work, right? Of course, they want to see the outcome right away. They want to push their agenda perhaps. But if you can show them how the engagement process is going to work, and I've signed off on it, and I provide it to the commission, then it's a pretty clear path, even with dates and times of how this is all going to work. So yeah, it's been really effective, but it is what I find the most challenge as a city manager, to make sure that each department is being consistent on how they use that. And that's why that engagement strategy, which is the umbrella for the entire city, kind of lays out, to use a direct term, expectations of how that engagement process is going to work. But it's got to be done on the front end. it has to be done with some consistency. And what I typically do too is I have our communications manager always look at those as well, along with me. And she's in charge of the consistency amongst the different departments.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, very cool.
And I'll just add on to that. I mean, that was something that we had intentionally done in Austin as we built the engagement program there. And I can testify to everything that Jeff said, is that, the organization, typically public organizations respond well when they have guidelines. And then you train to those guidelines. But, the public doesn't make a differentiation between the departments. If it's coming from the city, they ought to, and they deserve to expect some consistency in what it is that they should expect from that engagement. And that's really up to us to design and deliver on those parameters.
That's absolutely. Thank you. Let's switch over to the third question. Logan, I'd like to start with you. Can you talk about the strategies and tools that you have found successful for engaging your community, particularly as we get into this question, getting to those harder to reach populations, as well as how you're going about tracking your performance?
Yeah, I think I would echo a little bit of what I talked about before, that we've found that, whether it's community events or kind of events that we host or go find ourselves at, really getting out of City Hall. Folks are intimidated by City Hall. They don't typically know how to come in. They don't know how to talk at a meeting. They don't know what that always looks like. And so trying to demystify that a little bit, I think, has been really important. So whether that's been, some of the neighborhood meetings we've hosted, we're big proponents. We have a huge presence for a Night to Unite or National Night Out, various names. But I think we attended 50 parties in Rosemount just this last one. And so break the team up and spread out. Finding ways to do like the events that bring them in. So like a public works, public safety, touch a truck event, right? So like come see a truck, we'll have the helicopter land and the free food and the giveaways. Like that just gets people out of the home. And so that's been one of the best ways. But then digitally getting our way in has been really the use of the social media tools, the technology tools, surveying tools, like the POCO tool, the NCS tool. Those have been really valuable. So it's been kind of a bit try everything and see what sticks kind of approach, but we found our niche, and as of now, I think it's been helpful. The most recent census was really helpful to shine a light on the amount of diversity that we do have, and both ethnicity, language diversity, and so knowing how we need to produce documentation perhaps in other languages, that's been a kind of an eye-opener for us as well. And so relying on some of that data point and some of those metrics has been a guiding principle also.
Logan, are there any suggestions that you would offer up? You've got this new community, right, or growing community. So you've got a lot of new residents coming in. You've got some diversity growing into the community. And you're younger in your career. So as you start to think about how do you get harder to reach populations to engage, any suggestions or ideas that you'd like to offer up to others that have worked for you?
One of the cool ones that we do too that kind of comes to mind is we do a community leaders meeting. And so the notion that you never want to meet somebody or exchange business cards during a crisis, right? And so we invite pastors, school principals, community service organizations. We meet with them. The mayor leads a group once a month to meet with them. And so we have a really strong network of, I'll say, 30 leaders. So if a situation were to happen at somebody's church or school, we know how to support each other right away. But what that has proven or given us the chance to is we have a mosque in town. And so we have a close connection with the imam, and we go to their services, and we have a direct line into their community and into their facility. And so this notion of the mayor and the city council is kind of demystified for folks that maybe don't understand directly what American government always looks like, or American leadership looks like. Or if there's a language barrier, we know the folks leading those groups because we meet with them once a month to support each other, to share crises, and then just to share relationship, And so that community leaders group has been really impactful to making sure that we have a finger into every church, community organization, neighborhood group, etc.
Yeah, that trusted voice allows you to get a lot deeper into the community for sure. Yeah, thanks, Logan. I really appreciate it. Jeff, can you share with us some of the strategies and approaches that you're finding successful in Bozeman that's been able to help you build engagement with your residents, but also how you're going about tracking your performance?
Yeah, happy to. Maybe I can give you a couple examples about hard to reach populations, because I think that's where you need to get the most creative. We had a situation where we were thinking about extending sidewalks throughout a neighborhood that had been around for a long, long time, just kind of keeping up and catching up with some lack of infrastructure components into an area that we annexed, right? And all we really were trying to do was to change out streetlights to LED and also to put sidewalks to provide connectivity within the neighborhood. And we tried some of the stuff that some of the speakers mentioned before. We tried ice cream socials. We did all that kind of stuff to reach out to them, and we just were not getting much input at all. And here's how we ended up cracking that. We found someone that is, to use your words, Matt, a trusted person, but it wasn't trusted within government at all. It was actually a nurse within a medical clinic that almost all the families in this neighborhood went to, right? English wasn't the first language, right? That was a challenge. And number two is they really didn't know anybody that worked for city government. So we actually ended up knocking on doors with three people. One was the nurse that everybody knew that would actually knock on the door and they'd say hi and they'd open the door. Some people wouldn't open the door when we go before. The second was an interpreter. And the third was the dreaded engineer, because they had to describe the technical pieces of it. But the two trusted people were able to interpret. And then we brought an iPad with us that had a survey in Spanish where people could actually real time provide their input, right? So it did multiple things. One, it got the door open. We had a candid conversation, and then we had real time data results, right? We could show people. So far, we've talked to 10 people, and here are the results so far. I will say this, though. We learned a lot in that project, because what residents told us is we can walk in our streets within our neighborhood. We don't have a high traffic volume area. What we really need are sidewalks and bike paths to get to the shopping center. So we actually took the money, the capital money, out of the development from putting the sidewalks inside, and actually moved it to create connectivity from that neighborhood into the shopping center. And we would never have learned that without that kind of creative process. The last thing I'll say is that, I think there are generational differences in how people engage. I've talked about that a lot in different formats. Whether you're a baby boomer, you're a Gen Xer, or you're a millennial. Baby boomers typically come to meetings out of a sense of service, right? They feel they need to be there, especially in zoning. You have a zoning meeting and it'll be a lot of gray-haired folks there. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but that's just what happens. Gen Xers are the type that if they're at an event, they'll give you 5 minutes, but they're not going to come make a special effort to come to a meeting. Millennials, Gen Ys want to have an input, but if they feel that they're just going to go to a meeting and be bored, they have no interest whatsoever. So one of the most creative things we did to get to Gen Ys was we were having a conversation in the community about providing municipal broadband everywhere in the city. Millennials loved it, they told us, but they wouldn't engage. So we had an event called Broadband and Beers at a local brew pub, and the millennials came out in droves. The city didn't pay for the beer, just to be clear, but we hosted the event. We had some engagement, and they're really excited. So sorry for the long answers, but sometimes those stories help make a point better than me just telling how we do it.
No, I think that's great. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I think it also kind of points to what you said earlier, and that is closing the loop and the intentional listening, because the way that you're dealing with sidewalk installation is for connectivity purposes, as opposed to just getting, absolutely. That's just a great example of paying attention to what you're hearing and learning. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.
So I just want to clarify with Jeff, what you're saying is that beer is not an eligible ARPA expense.
You'd have to stretch that one, maybe.
I got to work on my plan, man. Thought that was part of wellness.
Hey, Doug, let's stick with you. Can you talk about what strategies and approaches you're finding successful in Grand Rapids for engaging residents and tracking performance?
Well, on the engagement side, I mean, I appreciate a lot of what both of these folks said, because there are also things that, that we've learned, that I've learned over time doing this in a couple of different communities. The trusted agents is a big thing. I think we in local government sometimes struggle with the conceit that we are well-meaning public servants, therefore, why wouldn't somebody open the door for us? And the first thing we've got to do is set the ego aside and understand that we don't get to make that decision. And no amount of flyering and event planning is going to change that fact. We also do work with our neighborhood organizations. We have contractual agreements with our neighborhood organizations to conduct engagement for us on certain activities at times, not just neighborhood organizations, but community-based organizations as well. So that has to be part of the matrix when you're planning your engagement. So I just wanted to reinforce that straight out of the gate. Some of the other things that I've found successful over time, I mean, I've kind of run the gamut. All the way from one end, doing mass call outs to bring people into a meeting that otherwise may not have even known that the meeting was happening, to doing that on the ground door knocking work. What we learned as we were going through the planning, not just for our community engagement plan, and now I'm going back to my time in Austin, but also when we started working through our language access plan, was that you really do need to hit the pause button and take a second to understand the idiosyncrasies of the sub-communities within your community. Jeff described something that worked in a neighborhood that was predominantly Hispanic, predominantly Spanish speaking. That's not necessarily the same overlay that you use when you're going into a Vietnamese community or a Burmese community or a Slovakian community. So you've got to take the time to understand who the players are and how do they prefer to meet. When we worked to engage the Burmese community in the most diverse area in all of Austin, the only way for us to crack that nut was to have meetings at one person's house, because they were the trusted agent. And that's where that community made the choice to gather. And we've got to understand that, especially, and we didn't talk about this, when we talk about refugee communities, those communities quite often aren't coming from a place where trust in local government is real high. Right. And they're bringing their whole selves with them, which means, kind of like what I said at the beginning, we don't get to make a choice of whether or not they like us and trust us, because they've got lived experience that tells them not to. So, that's the one thing that I would say is you've really got to be thoughtful, and you've got to tailor your work to the community that you're working to reach, and you've got to build those relationships over time. The other thing that I would say, and this is a really interesting example that we're doing right now, is around sustainability and climate change. So we all realize that there's disparate impacts on low-income and marginalized communities when it comes to the effects of climate change. We also know that predominantly the actors that are advocating for action on climate change look like all the people in this meeting right now. So we worked to flip that script. So we have an advocacy organization in town called UCC, the Urban Core Collaborative, multi-ethnic organization focused on addressing issues inside the city, inside their communities, and doing it on their terms. Now, typically, what we would do is we would internally work up an action plan, and then we'd put it out there, and UCC would be one of the organizations kind of on the other side of that, pushing back on us. On the front end of the process, we said, you know what? Not only are we going to invite you into this process, we are going to come up with a framework where you are part of a steering committee and you are actually paid to run this program. Rather than saying, you know what, we need to hire more staff to do this, we took the exact same amount of money, put it into an RFP, put it into a contract, and actually hired them to lead the work. So they have ownership, they're responsible for the deliverables, and they now have the facility to do that work on their terms. And that's the other conceit that I think that we need to set aside in local government, is that we're always the ones to fix the problem. Sometimes we've got to stop and we've got to listen to those loud voices. And the best way to engage them is to give them the ownership and the responsibility for the outcomes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that I think communities will probably want to explore that even more. The notion of contractually placing those expectations and opportunities at a neighborhood level is pretty cool, because it really does kind of change the way that people look at dealing with issues that you just, in a very conceited way, think that it's a community-wide kind of concern. So yeah, very, very interesting. Well, thank you. I know we're getting up to the end of the hour, and I really appreciate the time that all of you have provided. This has been just an excellent conversation. I love the way that you responded to these questions, not only in the ARPA kind of needs assessment. I love the intentional engagement focus and the priority that all of you are placing around the whole engagement topic. Really appreciate the consent versus ownership idea. I think that this is a great way to take a look at it and to consider it. Really appreciate the time. I do these every week. I would love, I'll follow up with all of you, and love to get some feedback on just how the panel went for you. But I'd also, even more importantly, just given the talent in the room, as we continue these panels on a weekly basis, I would be more than open to getting suggestions on what should be topics that should be covered in these panels. If there's certain areas that you think we could benefit local government practitioners on using this kind of a framework for communicating, I would love to hear that back from you. But I'll connect with you. We can talk about it offline. Thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate it. Great stuff today.